It is the last great expanse of land not under the control of the United States government. By the 1860s, most native tribes have succumbed to reservations. But Indians the Americans refer to as Sioux defiantly cling to their traditional way of life. For decades, their culture has revolved around the now declining herds of buffalo. The Sioux domain stretches across the northern plains from east of the Missouri River to the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming Territory. They consist of three primary tribal groups: the Dakota, the Nakota, and the Lakota.
The population of the Lakota probably was nearing 20,000. That made us one of the largest tribes in that region of the country. We were a force to be reckoned with, if nothing else.
Allied with the Lakota are upwards of 1,000 northern Cheyenne, who also roam the northern plains. They are joined by bands of southern Cheyenne, who are facing encroachment on their homelands in Colorado, Kansas, and present-day Oklahoma.
The northern Cheyenne were defending their way of life, their hunting lands, because they were so connected to the buffalo. It was now under a serious threat.
The U.S. population is 35 million and growing every day. The government is under intense pressure to open up Lakota and Cheyenne lands for settlement.
And they were trying to acquire land that nobody should own. You belong to the land does not belong to anybody. And this was in our culture, is how you care for the land, take care of it, live upon it, and move on.
The Treaty of 1868, signed at Fort Laramie in Wyoming Territory, creates the Great Sioux Reservation, far away from major transportation routes leading west. The reservation takes up the western half of present-day South Dakota. It includes the Lakota's sacred Black Hills.
If any place defines the Lakota, it's the Black Hills. It was the center of their physical world. And because of that, there were creation stories that emerged about the Black Hills of the Lakota.
But in the Black Hills and on the rest of the Great Sioux Reservation, the buffalo have already disappeared.
My ancestors realized that this resource was probably not going to come back in the numbers that it once had. So it started with hunger, and it ended up with fear and uncertainty.
Article 11 of the 1868 treaty stipulates that the Lakotas may leave the reservation and hunt the last of the great buffalo herds in a vast but loosely defined area called unceded territory.
The Lakotas were indeed in their treaty rights to occupy parts of the unceded territory. But some of the people who were not party to the 1868 treaty, who had not signed that accord, continued to live in that area and decided not to go on the reservation. And these people became the major bone of contention with the U.S. government.
Cheyenne leaders like Lame White Man and ICE refused to sign the Treaty of 1868, or for that matter, any treaty. So do Lakota leaders Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull.
Sitting Bull, he was a medicine man, a spiritual person, a traditional healer. And Crazy Horse was probably at the time the best known military leader. They were saying no to submitting to the authority of white America.
Just 6 years after the Treaty of 1868 comes the flashpoint that ignites a chain of events that will lead to the Little Bighorn. In 1874, just a year after a banking collapse had sent the economy tumbling, there are rumors of gold in the Black Hills. By treaty, the Black Hills are indisputably part of the Great Sioux Reservation. To lead an expedition into the Black Hills, the government looks to George Armstrong Custer, a Civil War hero, now Lieutenant Colonel of the 7th Cavalry.
George Armstrong Custer is one of the best known soldiers in the American Army. And he emerged from the Civil War as a golden cavalier, the young, bright star of the American Army.
In the summer of 1874, Custer confirms what many already know. There is gold in the Black Hills. Miners ignore the treaty. With the economy in a deep depression, the U.S. government does little to stop the stampede. 1875. The U.S. government attempts to buy the Black Hills. Lakota leaders refuse to sell. Many reservation Indians now leave to join Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, who continue living their traditional ways in the unceded territory.
Sitting Bull just wanted to be left alone, and he wanted to live on the land as his ancient people, ancestors did before him. And that was all he wanted.
The Lakota had been a thorn in the side of the United States for well over a generation. And finally, by 1875, with their refusal to sell the Black Hills, there is general agreement within the government that they have to be swept aside.
In the dead of winter, the United States gives those in the unceded territory an ultimatum. Report to the reservation by January 31st, 1876, or be branded hostile. The ultimatum is ignored. The U.S. government begins a campaign to force the Lakota and Cheyenne onto their reservations. It is the beginning of the Great Sioux War of 1876 and 1877.
The strategy was to field 3 columns of troops coming at the region from the south, from the west, and from the east.
Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer marches with the 7th Cavalry in the eastern column. Allied with the U.S. military are Indian scouts from the Crow and Arikara tribes. In the push for westward expansion, the Lakota have nearly annihilated the Arikara. And now Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse are encroaching on lands by treaty belonging to the Crow.
So the last chief of the Crow, Planicus, said it very well when he said that it wasn't because we love the white people why we sided for them. It was because we wanted to keep our lands.
In the spring of 1876, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull are joined by many who refuse to accept life on the reservation. The growing Lakota and Cheyenne village travels through the unceded territory. In late June, rumor of a large antelope herd leads them to a river the Crow call the Little Bighorn.
At that point, most of people realized that their way of life was over. Either we accepted their control or fight and die. Warriors were quite willing to fight and die. That's what they were bred to be, to fight, to defend, to die on behalf of their people.
Early on the morning of June 25th, Custer's Crow and Arikara scouts discover a large village on the Little Bighorn. Soon after, Lakota scouts spot the 7th Cavalry. Custer fears he will be attacked. Even more concerning is that the Lakota and Cheyenne will escape. Custer believes his best chance is to attack. He divides his command. Captain Frederick Benteen is to move southwest to prevent the Indians from escaping. Custer then orders Major Marcus Reno and 140 men to cross the Little Bighorn, advance down the valley, and engage the Indians. Custer tells Reno he will be supported. One of the Cheyenne in the village is Antelope Woman.
Women and children went to hide in the brush. War ponies were brought into the camp in the herds, and the warriors mounted them and galloped away.
Instead of charging the village, Reno's cavalry dismount and form a skirmish line.
The real threat was the soldiers coming right into the camp. Children, grandchildren, wives, mothers, aunts, grandparents, all those things were in imminent danger.
Reno's outnumbered men are quickly pushed back into timber along the Little Bighorn. Reno orders a retreat across the Little Bighorn to the bluffs overlooking the river.
It just becomes virtually every man for himself. Ride for your life. Reno does not seem to be in command of the situation. He's probably wondering in his head, what is Custer up to?
Custer, along with 209 men, has already advanced to the high ground to the east. He pauses on the bluffs overlooking the Little Bighorn, where he sees the Indian village for the first time. Custer then descends into ravines leading to the river. A possible plan: send one column across the river at Medicine Tail Coulee. While these soldiers attack, Custer moves north to flank the Indian village. One theory is that Custer, as he did at Washita, plans to capture women and children fleeing Reno's initial attack. Holding them as hostages, Custer would then end the battle and force the Indians back to the reservation.
All the warriors leave Major Reno's initial attack, and they come down to this new fight. Custer is now no longer the attacker, he's being attacked.
One imminent threat was the enemy was going to come into your camp and harm, kill, maim your family, your children, your grandparents. You're willing to do what it takes to defend them, to make sure that that enemy doesn't get into this camp.
Fighting and dying with Custer are Indian scouts, civilian personnel, and more than 200 soldiers of the 7th Cavalry.
The 7th Cavalry is very much a representation of the America of the late 19th century, with the Germans, the Italians, the Irish that make up the regiment, farm boys from the Midwest, soldiers of fortune from around the world, all of them seeking their future in the West, in the land of opportunity. None of them, of course, could ever dream that all of their dreams, all their hopes, all their aspirations would come to an end in what had to have been sheer terror as finally those ranks collapsed and it was every man for himself.
For Custer's command, the Little Bighorn becomes a battle of attrition. The column at Medicine Tail Coulee is repulsed at the Little Bighorn and moves up towards Battle Ridge. North of the village, Custer is overwhelmed by warriors. He retreats to what is today called Last Stand Hill.
Another story that my grandfather talked about was, he got kind of teary-eyed when he was talking about this. He observed one soldier. He said he got off his horse and took out his sidearm and shot this horse in the head. And the horse fell down. He says he used it as a barricade. And he said that man knew that he will never see the sunset. He said this is his last act of survival.
He must have thought he could win almost to the very end. But then finally, even Custer must have understood that they were doomed and that he was making a last stand.
There had to be a moment when most of those warriors realized they're all dead. That here was this hated, detested enemy. And you stopped him.
The shocking news of Custer's defeat reaches the East Coast 2 weeks later. Ironically, America is in the midst of celebrating its centennial, 100 years of freedom.
All of the political and military dignitaries of the country are in Philadelphia for the grand exposition that celebrates the industrial might of America. No one can believe it, but soon it is confirmed that Custer and 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry have been wiped out.
Not all at the Little Bighorn are killed. 2 days after the Custer battle, Reno, Benteen, and some 350 survivors are rescued from the bluffs overlooking the river. They spend the next 2 days helping bury the dead. The U.S. response to the Little Bighorn is swift and relentless. Congress authorizes more troops. After a particularly harsh winter, Sitting Bull leads his band into Canada in spring of 1877. 5 years later, he surrenders to the United States government. Less than a year after the Little Bighorn, most of the other Lakota and Cheyenne also surrender.
The Indians never won another battle in the Great Sioux War. They lost their land, they lost the unceded territory, they ended up confined on reservations, and they effectively lost everything.
Much of the Great Sioux Reservation, including the Black Hills, is opened for settlement.
And so the power of the United States is finally brought to bear, and its continental destiny is realized as a result of the death of Custer and the 7th Cavalry at Little Bighorn.
Today, most of the descendants of those who fought at the Little Bighorn live in South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana. Other descendants are scattered across the central and southern plains. The once Great Sioux Reservation has been reduced to 6 smaller ones. Every year, on the anniversary of the battle, they come to remember what many consider a spiritual victory.
where something tragic happened to our people, but yet something great happened to our people. Battle of Little Bighorn.
Five years after the battle, a granite monument was placed on Last Stand Hill. Beneath it lie the remains of those who died. In 1890, the first marble markers were laid where soldiers of the 7th Cavalry fell. They too are remembered every year on the anniversary of the battle. The 7th Cavalry continues as a fighting unit to this day. In 2003, an Indian memorial was dedicated to honor all the tribes who fought at the Little Bighorn. More than 60 warriors gave their lives defending their people and their way of life. Today, they too are being honored with markers.
To have this marker of my great-grandfather here, Noisy Walker, I feel very proud. I feel good today about it. And I'm glad the headstones are here in memories of our grandfathers. There.
Our country was born out of conflict. It was born out of struggle. And the battlefield of Little Bighorn speaks to that. It speaks to the sacrifice that is made by those on both sides. And like few other places, it really speaks to us emotionally about why people fight and what that struggle meant for who we are as Americans. All you have to do is walk the field. Your imagination will do the rest.